The Story of Civilization, Volume 3, Caesar and Christ, Part 2, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 4, Side 2. 6. Commodus. When the officer of the guard asked the dying Marcus for the watchword of the day, he answered, "Go to the rising sun. My sun is setting." The rising sun was then 19, a robust and dashing youth without inhibitions, morals, or fear. One would have expected of him, rather than of Marcus the ailing saint, a policy of war to victory or death. Instead, he offered the enemy immediate peace. They were to withdraw from the vicinity of the Danube, to surrender most of their arms, return all Roman prisoners and deserters, pay Rome an annual tribute of corn, and persuade 13,000 of their soldiers to enlist in the Roman legions. All Rome condemned him except the people. His generals fumed at allowing the trapped prey to escape and fight again another day. During the reign of Commodus, however, no trouble came from the Danubian tribes. The young prince, though no coward, had seen enough of war. He needed peace to enjoy Rome. Back in the capital, he snubbed the Senate and loaded the plebs with unprecedented gifts, 725 denarii to each citizen. Finding no field in politics for his exuberant strength, he hunted beasts on the imperial estates and developed such skill with sword and bow that he decided to perform publicly. For a time he left the palace and lived in the Gladiator's school. He drove chariots in the races and fought in the arena against animals and men. Presumably the men who opposed him took care to let him win. But he thought nothing of fighting, unaided and before breakfast, a hippopotamus, an elephant, and a tiger, which made no distinctions for royalty. He was so perfect a bowman that with 100 arrows he killed 100 tigers in one exhibition. He would let a panther leap upon some condemned criminal, and then slay the animal with one arrow, leaving the man unhurt to die again. He had his exploits recorded in the Acta Diurna, and insisted on being paid out of the treasury for each of his 1,000 combats as a gladiator. The historians upon whom we must depend here wrote, like Tacitus, from the viewpoint and traditions of the offended aristocracy. We cannot tell how much of the marvels they relate are history, how much are revenge. We are assured that Commodus drank and gambled, wasted the public funds, kept a harem of 300 women and 300 boys, and liked to vary his sex occasionally, at least by using a woman's garb, even at the public games. Tales of unbelievable cruelty are transmitted to us. Commodus ordered a votary of Bologna to amputate an arm in proof of piety, forced some women devotees of Isis to beat their breasts with pine cones till they died, killed men indiscriminately with his club of Hercules, gathered cripples together and slew them one by one with arrows. One of his mistresses, Marcia, was apparently a Christian. For her sake, we are told, he pardoned some Christians who had been condemned to the Sardinian mines. Her devotion to him suggests that in this man, described as more bestial than any beast, there was some lovable element unrecorded by history. Like his predecessors, he was aroused to the wildest ferocity by fear of assassination. His aunt Lucilla formed a conspiracy to kill him. He discovered it, had her executed, and on proof or suspicion of participation put so many men of rank to death that soon hardly any survived who had been prominent in Marcus's reign. Delators, who had almost disappeared for a century, returned to activity and favor, and a new terror raged in Rome. Appointing Perennis as praetorian prefect, Commodus yielded the reins of government to him and, the tradition says, abandoned himself to sexual dissipation. Perennis ruled efficiently but mercilessly. He organized his own terror and had all his opponents slain. The emperor, suspecting that Perennis planned to replace him, surrendered this second Sejanus to the Senate, which reenacted its role of glowing revenge. Cleander, a former slave, succeeded Perennis in 185 and surpassed him in corruption and cruelty. Any office might be had for a proper bribe. Any decision of any court could be reversed. Under his orders, senators and knights were put to death for treason or criticism. In 190, a mob besieged the villa where Commodus was staying and demanded Cleander's death. The emperor accommodated them. Cleander's successor, Laetus, after holding power for 3 years, judged that his time had come. One day he chanced upon a proscription list that contained the names of his supporters and friends, and of Marcia. On the last day of 192, Marcia gave Commodus a cup of poison, and when it worked too slowly, the athlete whom he had kept to wrestle with strangled him in his bath. He was a youth of 31. When Marcus died, Rome had reached the apex of her curve and was already touched with decay. Her boundaries had been extended beyond the Danube, into Scotland and the Sahara, into the Caucasus and Russia, and to the gates of Parthia. She had accomplished for that confusion of peoples and faiths a unity not of language and culture, but at least of economy and law. She had woven it into a majestic commonwealth, within which the exchange of goods moved in unprecedented plenty and freedom. And for 2 centuries she had guarded the great realm from barbarian inroads and had given it security and peace. All the white man's world looked to her as the center of the universe, the omnipotent and eternal city. Never had there been such wealth, such splendor, or such power. Nevertheless, amid the prosperity that made Rome brilliant in this 2nd century, all the seeds were germinating of the crisis that would ruin Italy in the 3rd. Marcus had contributed heavily to the debacle by naming Commodus his heir, and by wars that centralized ever more authority in the hands of the emperor. Commodus kept in peace the prerogatives assumed by Aurelius in war. Private and local independence, initiative, and pride withered as the power and functions of the state increased, and the wealth of nations was drained away by ever-rising taxation to support a self-multiplying bureaucracy and the endless offensives of defense. The mineral wealth of Italy was diminishing, pestilence and famine had taken bitter toll, the system of tillage by slaves was failing, governmental expenditures and doles had exhausted the treasury and debased the currency. Italian industry was losing its markets in the provinces through provincial competition, and no economic statesmanship appeared to make up for a languishing foreign trade by a wider distribution of buying power at home. Meanwhile, the provinces had recovered from the exactions of Sulla, Pompey, Caesar, Cassius, Brutus, and Antony. Their ancient skills had revived, their industries were flourishing, their new wealth was financing science, philosophy, and art. Their sons replenished the legions, their generals led them. Soon their armies would hold Italy at their mercy and make their generals emperors. The process of conquest was finished and was to be reversed. Henceforth the conquered would absorb the conquerors. As if conscious of these omens and problems, the mind of Rome at the close of the Antonine Age sank into a cultural and spiritual fatigue. The practical disfranchisements of first the assemblies and then the Senate had removed the mental stimulus that comes from free political activity and a widespread sense of liberty and power. Since the prince had almost all authority, the citizens left him almost all responsibility. More and more of them, even in the aristocracy, retired into their families and their private affairs. Citizens became atoms, and society began to fall to pieces internally precisely when unity seemed most complete. Disillusionment with democracy was followed by disillusionment with monarchy. The golden thoughts of Aurelius were often leaden thoughts, weighted down with the suspicion that Rome's problems could not be solved, that the multiplying barbarians could not long be held back by a sterile and pacific breed. Stoicism, which had begun by preaching strength, was ending by preaching resignation. Almost all the philosophers had made their peace with religion. For 400 years, Stoicism had been to the upper classes a substitute for religion. Now the substitute was put aside, and the ruling orders turned back from the books of the philosophers to the altars of the gods. And yet paganism too was dying. Like Italy, it was flushed only with governmental aid and was nearing exhaustion. It had conquered philosophy, but already its temple precincts heard reverently the names of invading deities. The age was heavy with the resurrection of the provinces and the incredible victory of Christ. Book 4. The Empire, 146 BC to AD 192. Chapter 21. Italy. 1. A roster of cities. Let us stop at this precarious zenith and try to realize that the empire was greater than Rome. We have lingered unduly at this brilliant center, which hypnotizes historians as it fascinated provincials. In truth, the vitality of the great realm no longer dwelt in the corrupt and dying capital. Its surviving health and strength, much of its beauty, most of its mental life, lay in the provinces and in Italy. We can have no just idea of what Rome meant, nor of its astounding achievement in organization and pacification, until we leave it and surrender ourselves to a tour of the 1,000 cities that made up the Roman world. "How shall I commence this undertaking?" the elder Pliny asked as he began his description of Italy. "So vast is the number of places, what man could enumerate them all? And so great is their individual renown." Around and south of Rome lay Latium, once her mother, then her enemy, then her granary, then a paradise of suburbs and villas for Romans who had both money and taste. South and west from the capital, fine roads and the Tiber led to the rival harbors of Portus and Ostia on the Tyrrhenian Sea. Ostia had its great age in the 2nd and 3rd centuries of our era. Merchants and longshoremen crowded its streets and filled its theaters. Its homes and apartment houses were remarkably like those of Rome today. As late as the 15th century, a Florentine traveler marveled at the wealth of the town and its sumptuous adornment. Some surviving columns and an altar elegantly designed and carved with delicate floral reliefs show even this commercial population had absorbed the classic conception of the beautiful. Southward on the coast rose Antium, now Anzio, where the richest Romans, many emperors, and favored gods had palaces or temples reaching out into the Mediterranean to catch any passing breeze. In its 3 miles of ruins were found such master sculptures as the Borghese Gladiator and the Apollo Belvedere. Nearby, an extant monument reminds excellent citizens, now 19 centuries dead, that they have recently had the pleasure of seeing 11 gladiators die in combat with 10 ferocious bears. To the north, beyond the coastal hills, Aquinum gave birth to Juvenal, and Arpinum plumed itself on Marius and Cicero. 20 miles from Rome was the old town of Praeneste, now Palestrina, its pretty homes built upon terraces in the mountain slopes, its gardens famous for their roses, its peak crowned with a celebrated temple to the goddess Fortuna Primigena, who gave good luck to women in childbirth and exchanged oracles for cash. Tusculum, 10 miles from Rome, was similarly rich in gardens and villas. Here old Cato was born, and Cicero placed his Tusculan Disputations. Most renowned of Rome's suburbs was Tibur, now Tivoli, where Hadrian spread his country house and Zenobia, queen of Palmyra, spent her captive years. North of Rome, Etruria experienced under the Principate a modest resurrection. Perugia was largely destroyed and partly restored by Augustus, whose artists beautified there an old Etruscan arch. Aretium gave Maecenas to Rome and pottery to the world. Pisa was already hoar with age. It traced its name and origin to a colony of Greeks from Pisa in the Peloponnesus, and made a living by organizing the lumber business along the Arnus River. Farther up the same stream was a young Roman colony, Florentia, rare among cities because it probably underestimated its future. At the northwestern extremity of Etruria were the quarries of Carrara. Rome's finest marble was conveyed thence to the port of Luna and went by ship to the capital. Genoa had long served as an outlet for the goods of northwestern Italy. As far back as 209 BC, we hear of the Carthaginians destroying it in a ruthless commercial war. It has been destroyed many times since, and has always achieved a fairer reincarnation. Under the Alps lay Augusta Taurinorum, founded by the Taurini Gauls and made a Roman colony by Augustus. Its ancient pavements and drains can still be seen under the streets of Turin. And a massive gate survives from Augustan days to remind us that the city was once a fortress against invaders from the north. Here the lazy Padus, now the Po, rising in the Cottian Alps, turns eastward 250 miles to divide North Italy into what the early Republic knew as Transpadane and Cispadane Gaul. In all the peninsula, the valley of the Po was the region most fertile, populous, and prosperous. At the foot of the Alps were those lakes, Verbenus, now Maggiore, Larius, now Como, and Benicus, now Garda, whose splendor feasted the eye and soul of those generations as well as ours. From the younger Pliny's Comum, a main trade route led south to Mediolanum, now Milan. Settled by the Gauls in the 5th century BC, it was already a metropolis and educational center in the days of Virgil. By AD 286 it would replace Rome as the capital of the Western Empire. Verona controlled the trade over the Brenner Pass and was rich enough to have an amphitheater, recently restored, seating 25,000 spectators. Along the winding Po rose Placentia, now Piacenza, Cremona, Mantua, and Ferrara, originally frontier towns designed to hold the Gauls at bay. North of the Po and east of the Adige lay Venetia. The district took its name from the Veneti, early immigrants from Illyria. Herodotus tells how the leaders of these tribes annually brought together the marriageable lasses in their villages, put a price upon each according to her beauty, wed her to the man who paid the price, and used the money to provide alluring dowries for the less alluring girls. Venice itself was not yet born, but at Pola on the Istrian peninsula, at Tergesti, now Trieste, Aquileia, and Patavium, now Padua, substantial cities crowned the head of the Adriatic. Pola still has from Roman days a stately arch, a pretty temple, and an amphitheater only less impressive than its model, the Colosseum. South of the Po, a line of important cities ran from Placentia through Parma, Mutina, now Modena, Bononia, now Bologna, and Faventia, now Faenza, to Ariminum. Here at Rimini is one of the most perfectly preserved of the countless bridges built by Roman engineers. It carried the Flaminian Way into the city through an arch as strong and dominating as the Roman character. A branch road led from Bononia to Ravenna, the Venice of Roman days, built upon piles in marshes made by several rivers emptying into the Adriatic. Strabo describes it as provided with thoroughfares by means of bridges and ferries. Augustus stationed there his Adriatic fleet, and several emperors in the 5th century made the city their official residence. The superior fertility of northern Italy, its healthier and more stimulating climate, its mineral resources, varied industries, and cheaply born river trade raised the region to economic supremacy over central Italy in the 1st century of our era and to political leadership in the 3rd. South of Ariminum, the eastern coast, rocky, stormy, and harborless, developed few cities of moment north of Brundisium. And yet there were in Umbria, Picenum, Samnium, and Apulia many small towns whose wealth and art can be judged only by studying Pompeii. Assisium gave birth to Propertius as well as St. Francis, Sarsina to Plautus, Amiternum to Sallust, Sulma to Ovid, Venusia to Horace. Beneventum was famous not only for a Pyrrhic defeat, but for the great arch erected there by Trajan and Hadrian. On its virile reliefs, Trajan told the story of his achievements in war and peace. On the southeastern coast, Brundisium commanded traffic with Dalmatia, Greece, and the east. Within the heel, Tarentum, once a proud city-state, was now a declining winter resort for Roman magnates and aristocrats. In southern Italy, large estates had absorbed most of the land and turned it to pasture. The cities lost their peasant patronage and their business classes waned. The Greek communities that had sported their sybaritic wealth in earlier times had been ruined by barbarian infiltration and the Second Punic War, and were now reduced to small towns in which Latin was slowly replacing Greek. On the toe, Rhegium, now Regio, had a good harbor and flourished on the trade with Sicily and Africa. Up the west coast, Velia could hardly remember the days when Parmenides and Zeno had made it, as Ilia, ring with metaphysical poetry and impish paradox. Posidonia, which still amazes visitors with its majestic temples, had been renamed Paestum by its Roman colony, and its Greek stock was melting in a flux of barbarian, here Italian, blood from the countryside. Only in Campania was Greek civilization alive in Italy. Geographically, Campania, the mountains and coast around Naples, was part of Samnium. Economically and culturally, it was a world by itself, industrially more advanced than Rome, financially powerful, and crowding into a little space an intense life of political turmoil, literary competition, artistic exuberance, Epicurean luxury, and exciting public games. The land was fertile and produced the finest olives and grapes in Italy. Hence came the famous Serentine and Falernian wines. Probably Varro was thinking of Campania when he challenged the world. You who have wandered over many lands, have you ever seen any better cultivated than Italy? Is not Italy so stocked with fruit trees as to seem one great orchard? At the southern end of Campania, a precipitous peninsula ran out from Salernum to Sarentum. Villas nestled among the vines and orchards on the hills and garlanded the shore. Sarentum was as beautiful as Sorrento is now. The elder Pliny called it nature's own delight, upon which she had poured out all her gifts. Hardly anything seems to have changed there in 2,000 years. The people and their customs are probably the same, almost the same their gods. And the cliffs still stand, the sea's unending siege. Facing this promontory lay the buffeted isle of Caprii, now Capri. On the southern side of the gulf, Vesuvius smoked, while Pompeii and Herculaneum slept under their lava coat. Then came Neapolis, New Town, the most Greek of Italian cities in Trajan's day. In Naples' laziness we watch an echo of its ancient addiction to love and sport and art. The people were Italian, the culture, customs, games were Greek. Here were fine temples, palaces, and theaters. Here, every 5th year, were held those contests in music and poetry at which Statius had won a prize. In the western corner of the gulf was the port of Puteoli, now Pozzuolo, named from the stench of its sulphur pools. It throve on Rome's trade and on manufactures of iron, pottery, and glass. An amphitheater here shows us, by its well-preserved underground passages, how gladiators and beasts were introduced into the arena. Across the harbor of Puteoli sparkled the villas of Baiae, doubly attractive in their setting between mountains and sea. Here Caesar, Caligula, and Nero played, and rheumatic Romans came to bathe in mineral springs. The place profited from its reputation for gambling and immorality. Varro reports that maidens there were common property, and many boys were girls. Claudius thought Cicero irremediably disgraced for having gone there once. "Do you suppose," asks Seneca, "that Cato would ever have dwelt in a pleasure palace so that he might count the lewd women as they sailed past, the many kinds of barges painted in all sorts of colors, the roses wafted about the lake?" A few miles north of Baiae, in the crater of a dead volcano, Lake Avernus emitted sulphurous fumes of such potency that legend said no bird could fly above it and live. Near it was the cave through which Aeneas, in Virgil's epic, had made his facilis descensus Averni into Tartarus. North of the lake was the old city of Cumae, now slowly dying through the superior attractions of her daughter city Neapolis, the better harbors of Puteoli and Ostia, and the industries of Capua. Capua lay 30 miles inland, in a fertile region that sometimes harvested 4 crops in a year, and its bronze and iron works were unrivaled in Italy. Rome had so severely punished it for helping Hannibal that for 2 centuries it failed to recover, and Cicero spoke of it as the abode of the politically dead. Caesar restored it with thousands of new colonists, and in Trajan's time it was prospering again. Listed so rapidly, these major cities of classic Italy are merely names. We mistake them for words on a map and hardly feel that they were the noisy abodes of sensitive men eagerly pursuing food and drink, women and gold. Let us turn over the ashes of one Roman habitation, and from its strangely preserved vestiges try to recapture some movement of the life that ran in those ancient streets. 2. Pompeii. Pompeii was one of the minor towns of Italy, hardly noticed in Latin literature except for its fish sauces, its cabbage, and its burial. Founded by Oceans, perhaps as early as Rome, peopled by Greek immigrants, captured by Sulla and turned into a Roman colony, it was partly destroyed by an earthquake in AD 63 and was being rebuilt when Vesuvius destroyed it again. On August 24, AD 79, the volcano exploded and hurled dust and rock high into the air amid clouds of smoke and flashes of flame. A heavy rainfall turned the erupted matter into a torrent of mud and stone, which in 6 hours covered Pompeii and Herculaneum to a depth of 8 or 10 feet. All that day and the next the earth shook and buildings fell. Audiences were buried in the ruins of theaters, hundreds were choked by dust or fumes, and tidal waves shut off escape by sea. The elder Pliny was at that time commanding the western fleet at Misenum, near Puteoli. Moved by appeals for help and by curiosity to observe the phenomenon at closer range, he boarded a small vessel, landed on the southern shore of the Gulf, and rescued several persons. But as the party ran from the advancing hail and smoke, the old scientist was overcome, fell in his tracks, and died. The next morning his wife and his nephew joined the desperate crowd that fled down the coast, while from Naples to Sorrento the continuing eruption blackened the day into night. Many refugees, separated in the darkness from their husbands, wives, or children, made the terror worse with their laments and shrieks. Some prayed to divers gods for help, some cried out that all gods were dead and that the long-predicted end of the world had come. When on the 3rd day the sky cleared at last, lava and mud had covered everything of Pompeii but the rooftops, and Herculaneum had completely disappeared. Of approximately 20,000 population in Pompeii, probably some 2,000 lost their lives. Several of the dead were preserved by a volcanic embalmment. The rain and pumice stone that fell upon them made a cement that hardened as it dried, and the filling of these impromptu molds has made some gruesome plaster casts. A few of the survivors dug into the ruins to recover valuables. Thereafter the site was abandoned and was slowly covered by the detritus of time. In 1709 an Austrian general sank a shaft at Herculaneum, but the tufa layer was so thick, in some places 65 feet, that excavations had to proceed by slow and costly tunneling. The exhuming of Pompeii began in 1749 and has gone on at intervals since. Today most of the ancient town has been uncovered and has revealed so many houses, objects, and inscriptions that in some ways we know ancient Pompeii better than ancient Rome. The center of its life, as in every Italian city, was the Forum. Once, doubtless, it had been the gathering point for farmers and their produce on market days. Games were held there and dramas were performed. There the citizens had raised shrines to their gods. At one end to Jupiter, at the other to Apollo, and nearby to Venus Pompeiana, the patron goddess of the town. But they were not a religious people. They were too busy with industry and politics, games and venery to have much time for worship. And even in worship they honored the phallus as the crown of their Dionysian ritual. When economic and state affairs swelled in volume and dignity, great buildings rose around the forum for administration, negotiation, and exchange. We may judge from modern Italian towns how the adjoining streets throbbed with the hawking of peddlers, the disputes of buyers and sellers, the noise of crafts by day and revelry by night. In the ruins of the shops, excavators found some of the charred and petrified nuts, loaves, and fruits that so narrowly escaped a purchaser. Farther down the streets were the taverns, gambling houses, and brothels, each zealous to be all in one. We might not have guessed the keenness of Pompeii's life had not its people scratched their sentiments upon public walls. 3,000 such graffiti have been copied there, and presumably there were thousands more. Sometimes the authors merely inscribed their names or obscene audacities, as men still love to do. Sometimes they gave hopeful instructions to enemies, as Samius Cornelio suspendere. Samius to Cornelius, go hang yourself. Many of the inscriptions are love messages, often in verse. Romula notes that she tarried here with Stephalus, and a devoted youth writes, Victoria vale et ubique es suaviter sternutas. Goodbye, Victoria, and wherever you are, may you sneeze pleasantly. Quite as numerous as these messages are the carved or painted announcements of public events or private offerings. Landlords advertised vacancies, losers described missing articles, guilds and other groups declared themselves for promising candidates in the municipal campaigns. So the fishermen have named Pompedius Rufus for aedile. The lumbermen and the charcoal sellers ask you to elect Marcellinus. Some graffiti announced gladiatorial games, others proclaimed the valor of famous gladiators like Celadus, Suspirium Puellarum, the maiden's sigh, or breathed devotion to a favorite actor. Actius, darling of the people, come back soon. Pompeii lived to be amused. It had 3 public baths, a palestra, a small theater seating 2,500, a larger one accommodating 5,000, and an amphitheater where 20,000 persons could enjoy by proxy the agony of death. One inscription reads, 30 pairs of gladiators furnished by the Duumvir will fight at Pompeii on November 24th, 25th, and 26th. There will be a hunt, or venatio. Hooray for Maius! Bravo, Paris! Maius was Duumvir or city magistrate. Paris was the leading gladiator. The remains of the domestic interiors suggest a life of solid comfort and varied art. Windows were exceptional, central heating was rare. Bathrooms appear in the richer homes, and a few houses had an outdoor pool in a peristyled garden. Floors were of cement or stone, sometimes of mosaic. One franc moneymaker had the words Salve Lucrum, Hail Gain, lettered in his floor. Another inscribed his with Lucrum Gandium, Gain is joy. Little has been found of the ancient furniture. Nearly all was of wood and perished, but a few tables, couches, chairs, and lamps of marble or bronze have survived. In the museums at Pompeii and Naples may be seen the miscellanea of domestic life, pens, inkstands, scales, kitchen utensils, toilet articles, and musical instruments. The art recovered from Pompeii or near it suggests that not only the aristocrats of the villas but the merchants of the city enjoyed the cultural accessories of life. A private library unearthed at Herculaneum had 1,756 volumes or rolls. We must not repeat what we have said of the Bosco Reale cups or the rich vistas and graceful women painted upon the walls of Pompeian homes. Many dwellings had excellent sculptures, and the Forum contained 150 statues. In the Temple of Jupiter, a head of the god was found which Phidias himself might have carved, strength and justice framed in the curls of abounding hair and beard. In the Temple of Apollo was a statue of Diana, equipped with a hole in the back of the head through which a hidden ministrant might utter oracles. In one Herculanean villa, enough first-class bronzes were found to fill a famous room at the Naples Museum. Presumably the masterpieces in this collection, the resting Mercury, the Narcissus or Dionysus, the drunken satyr, and the dancing faun, were of Greek origin or workmanship. They reveal the skillful technique and the shameless joy in the healthy body characteristic of Praxitelean art. One of them, however, a bravely realistic bust in bronze, shows the bald head and sharp but not unkindly face of L. Caecilius Eucundus, a Pompeian auctioneer whose accounts, inscribed upon 154 wax tablets, were found in his house at Pompeii. Supremely human in its mixture of coarseness and intelligence, wisdom and warts, this work of a contemporary, perhaps Italian, sculptor is a welcome foil to the unwrinkled gods and goddesses who surround it in the Naples Museum and who confess by their smooth and placid features that they never lived. 3. Municipal life. Life, private and public, individual and corporate, has never been lived more intensely than in ancient Italy, but the events of our own time are too vital and absorbing to let us spare interest for the details of municipal organization under the Caesars. The confusing diversities of constitution and the jealous gradations of franchise are no longer a part of that living past which is our matrix and our theme. It was a basic feature of the Roman Empire that, though divided into provinces, it was organized into an assemblage of relatively self-governed city-states, each owning an extensive hinterland. Patriotism meant love of one's city rather than of the empire. Normally, the freemen of each community were content to exercise a purely local franchise, and those non-Romans who had won Roman citizenship rarely went to Rome to vote. As the example of Pompeii shows, the decay of the assemblies in the capital was not accompanied by a similar debasement in the cities of the empire. Most Italian municipalities had a senate, or curia, and most eastern cities had a council, or bulle, that formulated ordinances, and an assembly, a comitia or ecclesia, that chose the magistrates. Each magistrate was expected to give his city a substantial sum, summa honoraria, from onos, office, for the privilege of serving it, and custom required him also to make incidental donations for public benefits or games. As no pay attached to office, the democracy, or aristocracy, of freemen issued almost everywhere in an oligarchy of wealth and power. For 200 years, from Augustus to Aurelius, the municipalities of Italy prospered. There was a majority of poor in them, of course. Nature and privilege had seen to this. But never before or since, so far as history tells, have the rich done so much for the poor. Practically all the expenses of operating the city, of financing dramas, spectacles, and games, of building temples, theaters, stadiums, palestras, libraries, basilicas, aqueducts, bridges, and baths, and adorning these with arches, porticos, painting, and statuary, fell upon men of means. And in the first 2 centuries of the empire, these philanthropies were carried out with a competitive patriotism that in some cases bankrupted the families that contributed or the cities that maintained the benefactions. In time of famine, it was usual for the wealthy to buy food and distribute it gratis among the poor. On occasion, they furnished free oil or wine, or a public banquet, or a gift of money to all citizens, sometimes to all inhabitants. Extant inscriptions abound in commemorations of such generosity. A millionaire gave Altinum in Venetia 1,600,000 sesterces for public baths. A rich lady built a temple and an amphitheater for Casinum. Decimus Tullus gave Tarquinii baths costing 5 million sesterces. Cremona, destroyed by Vespasian's troops, was rapidly rebuilt by the contributions of private citizens, and 2 physicians exhausted their fortunes in gifts to Naples. At populous Ostia, Lucilius Gemella invited all the inhabitants to dinner, paved a long and spacious avenue, repaired or restored 7 temples, rebuilt the municipal baths, and donated 3 million sesterces to the city treasury. It was the custom of many rich men to invite a considerable portion of the citizenry to a feast on the occasion of their birthday, their election to office, their daughter's marriage, their son's assumption of the toga virilis of manhood, or the dedication of a building which they had presented to the community. In return for such favors, the city voted the giver an office, a statue, a panegyric, or an inscription. The poor were not overwhelmed with all these gifts. They accused the rich of deriving the means of philanthropy from exploitation, and they demanded less ornate buildings and cheaper corn, less statuary, and more games. When we add to private munificence the donations of the emperors to the towns, the buildings erected and the catastrophes mitigated in them by imperial funds, and the public works and functions financed by the municipal treasury, we begin to feel the splendor and pride of the Italian cities under the Principate. Streets were paved, drained, policed, and adorned. Free medical service was maintained for the poor. Clean water was piped into private homes for a small fee. Food was offered to the poor at a low price. Public baths were often free through private subsidies. Alimenta were paid to straitened families to help them rear their children. Schools and libraries were built. Plays were presented. Concerts were given. Games were arranged in reckless emulation of Rome. Civilization in the Italian towns was not so materialistic as in the capital. They rivaled one another in erecting amphitheaters, but also they raised noble temples, sometimes equaling Rome's best, and made the months gay with picturesque religious festivals. They spent freely on works of art and provided halls for lecturers, poets, sophists, rhetors, philosophers, and musicians. They supplied their citizens with facilities for health, cleanliness, and recreation, and a vigorous cultural life. From them, not from Rome, came most of the great Latin authors, and some of the finest sculptural masterpieces in our museums, like the Nike of Naples, the Eros of Centum Celli, the Zeus of Otricoli. They supported as large a population as their modern successors before our century, and gave it an unparalleled security from war. The first 200 years of our era saw the zenith of the great peninsula. Chapter 22. Civilizing the West. 1. Rome and the Provinces. The blot on Italian prosperity, aside from a system of slavery common to ancient states, was its partial dependence upon provincial exploitation. Italy was free of taxation because the provinces had yielded so much in plunder and tribute. To them could be traced some of the wealth that came to flower in the Italian towns. Rome, before Caesar, frankly classed the provinces as conquered territory. All their inhabitants were Roman subjects, only a few were Roman citizens. All their land was the property of the Roman state and was held by the possessors on revocable grants from the imperial government. To lessen the likelihood of revolt, Rome cut conquered regions into smaller states, forbade any province to have direct political dealings with another, and favored the business classes against the lower classes everywhere. Divide et impera was the secret of Roman rule. Cicero perhaps exaggerated when, in excoriating Verres, he pictured the Mediterranean nations as desolate under the Republic. All the provinces mourn, all free peoples cry out, all kingdoms protest against our cruelty and greed. From one ocean to another there is no place, however hidden or remote, that has not felt our lust and our iniquity. The Principate dealt more liberally with the provinces, not from generosity so much as from husbandry. Taxation was made bearable, local religions, languages, and customs were respected, freedom of speech was allowed except for attacks against the sovereign power, and local laws were retained so far as they did not conflict with Roman profit and mastery. A wise flexibility created a useful diversity of rank and privilege among and within the subject states. Certain municipalities, like Athens and Rhodes, were free cities. They paid no tribute, were not subject to the provincial governor, and managed their domestic affairs without Roman interference so long as they maintained social order and peace. Some old kingdoms, like Numidia and Cappadocia, were allowed to keep their kings, but these were clients of Rome, dependent upon her protection and her policy, and required to aid her with men and materials at her call. In the provinces, the governor, proconsul or propraetor, combined in himself the power to legislate, to administer, and to judge. His power was limited only by the free cities, by a Roman citizen's right of appeal to the emperor, and by the financial supervision exercised by the provincial questor or procurator. Such near omnipotence invited abuse, and though the lengthening of the governor's term under the Principate, his ample salary and allowance, and his financial responsibility to the emperor considerably lessened malfeasance, we may see from the letters of Pliny and some passages in Tacitus that extortion and corruption were still no rarities at the end of the 1st century. Taxation was a primary industry of the governor and his aides. Under the empire, a census was taken of every province for the purpose of assessing the tax on land and the tax on property, which included animals and slaves. To stimulate production, a fixed tribute was substituted for the tithe. Publicans no longer gathered these taxes, but they collected port duties and managed some state forests, mines, and public works. The provinces were expected to contribute towards a golden crown for each new emperor, pay the cost of provincial administration, and in some cases send heavy shipments of grain to Rome. The old custom of liturgies was maintained in the east and spread through the west, by which the local or Roman government might ask rich men to provide loans for war, ships for the navy, buildings for public purposes, food for famine victims, or choruses for festivals and plays. Cicero, having joined the inns, contended that the taxes paid by the provinces barely covered the cost of administration and defense. Defense included the suppression of revolts, and administration presumably embraced the perquisites that made so many Roman millionaires. We must reconcile ourselves to the probability that whatever power establishes security and order will send tax-gatherers to collect something more than the cost. Despite all levies, the provinces prospered under the Principate. The emperor and the Senate exercised a more careful supervision under provincial staffs, and severely punished those who stole beyond their station. Ultimately, the excess taken from the provinces flowed back to them in payment for their goods, and in the end, the industries so supported made the provinces stronger than a precariously parasitic Italy. A government, said Plutarch, ought to give a people 2 boons above all, liberty and peace. As to peace, he wrote, there is no need to occupy ourselves, for all war has ceased. As to liberty, we have that which the government, Rome, leaves us, and perhaps it would not be good if we had any more. 2. Africa. Corsica and Sardinia were classed together as a province, not as parts of Italy. Corsica was for the most part a mountainous wilderness, in which Romans hunted the natives with dogs to sell them as slaves. Sardinia provided slaves, silver, copper, iron, and grain. It had 1,000 miles of road and one excellent harbor, Careles, now Cagliari. Sicily had been reduced to an almost purely agricultural province as one of the frumentary supports of Rome. Its arable soil was largely taken up with latifundia devoted to cattle raising, and manned by slaves so poorly clothed and fed that they periodically revolted and escaped to form robber bands. The island had in Augustus's days some 750,000 souls. In 1930 it had 3,972,000. Of its 65 cities, the most flourishing were Catania, Syracuse, Tauromenium, now Taormina, Messina, Agrigentum, and Panormus, now Palermo. Syracuse and Tauromenium had magnificent Greek theaters, still in use today. Despite Verres' depredations, Syracuse was so full of impressive architecture, famous sculptures, and historic sites that provincial guides prospered on the tourist trade, and Cicero considered it the finest city in the world. Most well-to-do urban families had farms or orchards in the suburbs, and the whole Sicilian countryside was fragrant with fruit trees and vineyards, as it is today. All that Sicily lost through Roman domination, Africa gained. It gradually replaced Sicily as an unwilling granary for Rome, but in return Roman soldiers, colonists, businessmen, and engineers made it blossom into a hardly credible affluence. Doubtless the new conquerors had found certain regions thriving when they came. Between the mountains that frowned upon the Mediterranean and the Atlas Range that kept out the Sahara ran a semi-tropical valley sufficiently watered by the Bagradus, now Majerda River, and 2 months of rain to repay the patient husbandry that Mago had taught and Massinissa had enforced. But Rome improved and expanded what she found. Her engineers built dams across the rivers that flowed down from the southern hills. They gathered the surplus water in reservoirs in the rainy season and poured it into irrigation canals in the hot months when the streams ran dry. Rome asked no heavier taxes than native chiefs had levied, but her legion and fortifications gave better protection against nomad raiders from the mountains. Mile by mile, new soil was won from desert or savagery for cultivation and settlement. The valley produced so much olive oil that when in our 7th century the Arabs came, they were amazed to find that they could ride from Tripoli to Tangier without ever moving from the shade of olive trees. Towns and cities multiplied, architecture exalted them, and literature found new voice. The ruins of Roman forums, temples, aqueducts, and theaters on now arid wastes reveal the reach and wealth of Roman Africa. Those fields decayed and became dead sand not through a change in climate, but through a change in government, from a state that gave economic security, order, and discipline to one that allowed chaos and negligence to ruin the roads, reservoirs, and canals. At the head of this restored prosperity was the resurrected city of Carthage. This book is continued on Cassette 5, Side 1.